we're going to learn Likkutei Sichos for Parshas Kedoshim, which is what we're reading in Eretz Yisrael this week. And in Chutz La'aretz, they're going to be reading Achrei. And you always got to ask this question every year that this happens. Why in the world don't they just read Achrei Mot Kedoshim this week?
I asked that question many years
ago. Yeah, every year that this happens, you have to ask
the
them.
answer that I was giving was like this, right? That since there's a difference between one and the other, so the Rabbanim make it this gigantic gap. It's all the way through, right through to Erev Tisha B'Av. That's when they join up again. Erev Tisha B'Av. Parshas Chazon.
That's when they join up.
Parshas Chazon.
You're saying they only join up Matot Masei? So anyway.
The Rabbanim did it deliberately, like to make a big inyan out of it. It's the only answer I ever got.
I don't think
there's
there's
a dozen times when they could have joined up.
Not a dozen. There's Achrei Mot Kedoshim, and there's Chukat Balak, and there's Matot Masei. Those are the three times. Sorry, Behal Chukotai also.
Right.
So they had 4 different opportunities to do it.
They take the last one.
It's very, very unclear thing. Making a big deal out of it doesn't make any sense.
Well, it doesn't make sense per se, so you know.
There's probably some other reason we don't know. Or, okay. So, our problem is that we're learning this in English, and a lot of the people that are watching are not in Israel. So, they're going to be a week off. So, if you're listening to this and you're not in Eretz Yisrael, so know that you're a week ahead. You get to be a week ahead now.
So they can save it for next week.
Right. And next week I won't be here. I'll actually be in LA.
That was the time when there's the gap. There's a minion that catches up.
Yeah. But that's nice for them. I'm not going to watch.
They're letting a whole surgery.
No, that's not
praying for this. You know, when there's only like one person.
For one person, it's a question about the other people. But okay. Let's see from the beginning. But really what I wanted to do was, because of how this was organized, if you remember last week when we did learn one day, Achrei Mot, so it was very, very short. It's just 2 pages. And I think the reason for that is that usually Achrei Mot and Kedoshim are connected. So really the Achrei that we learned, which was, I said it was the submission part of the Sicha, really needs to be connected to the continuation, to Kedoshim. And then you have a submission, separation, sweetening order. And the separation starts from chapter 6 in Kedoshim, and the sweetening starts from chapter 14. So I was debating about whether we should learn from chapter 1 to 5, but we should. I don't know if we'll get a chance to finish the very, very important separation inyan here. One of the most important inyanim that I've learned in a long time. And I had the chance to talk about the Sicha in Sudas Mashiach because it's very, very much related to Pesach and to Sudas Mashiach. Okay. The beginning of Parshas Kedoshim, we have 3 different commandments. Kedoshim to you, first of all, you should be holy. Meaning, you should strive to make your life holy by addressing the way you relate to things that are permissible. That's how you become holy. Holy is not by doing what you need to do. Holy is by doing something that you don't need to do. That in a sense was permissible to you. And the way that Chassidus sees this is that is not needed. And what it means by not needed is not that you shouldn't partake from it, not that you shouldn't use it, but that it should be sanctified. And how do you sanctify in Chassidus? According to Chassidus, as we'll see in the second part of the Sicha, to sanctify something means that I'm doing it because God told me to do it, and not because my animal soul craves it. That's the big change that happens when you sanctify something. So in other words, you do away with the natural instinct and the feeling that it naturally belongs to me, and you replace that with a feeling that this is for Hashem, I'm doing this for God. Secondly, there's the commandment, Ish imo v'aviv tirau, that you should literal translation is fear, but it's more like be sensitive to your mother and your father. And then et Shabtotai tishmoru, and the third one is to keep Shabbos. But Torah baharei kol davar b'daikanut. The fact that the Torah brought these things together has a meaning. It's not just by chance that they're together. It sounds like a little bit of a list, but this list was brought together for a very good reason. Chapter 2. Mashmauta shel kedusha kan hi havdala, ka'amur b'sof ha'parasha. As we began to say, sanctifying here, to become holy, to become sacred, means to be separate. That's what sanctity really means. People have this whole thing that they have this atmosphere thing they feel about, this ambiance or whatever. That's the result maybe of there being something holy. Something holy means something that is set apart, that is separate. Ka'amur b'sof ha'parasha v'yitem li kedoshim v'yitkadishtem v'yitem li kedoshim. You should be, because there's a whole problem here. How can a person be? What kind of holiness can a person be? Can he be like God? So the sages say, "Yachol kamoni." Can you become sacred like me? Meaning so set apart as I am, as God is from the world. Because God is both the world and He's also completely beyond the world. So He says, "Yachol kedushatchem ki kedushati." Can your holiness be like mine? Can you set yourself apart as much as I am? And so it says that you can't. And yet, at the end of the parsha, it says, "V'itkadishtem v'item li kedoshim." And then it explains, what kind of sanctity can you achieve? Sanctity that, as we said, is devoted to me. Things that are permissible, and doing them for the sake of holiness, that way you come to be holy like God, as much as a human being can. So even though you can't completely be holy, like me, you can't be outside the world, and yet, what we say is, in Welt, aus Welt. You're in the world and outside the world. Is by making sure that everything that you do is for the sake of God, for the sake of holiness.
Maybe because you're elevated.
So if you're elevated, you're not imbued. You're either outside or inside.
Yeah,
the Torah wants you to be both.
You put it one step higher than it was before.
Good, settle. But then it's a question about whether you're really holy. Maybe that's not God's holiness. But to attain God's holiness is to do things for the sake of godliness. ופירוש הדבר של בני ישראל ייבדל מאומות העולם ככתוב נפנינו אני ועמך מכל העם אשר על פני האדמה. The Rebbe here gives another explanation. He says, first of all, what it means is to be separate from the nations. You're not the same as everyone else. And so there's, niflinu means aflaya today. Aflaya means to have a bias towards someone. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu asks of Hashem when he takes them from Mount Sinai, because Hashem wanted to destroy them first because of the sin of the golden calf. And after he gave up on that plan, so then he said, but I won't be in your midst, because if I'm in your midst, I will be too vengeful against what you do. I'm too demanding. So instead I'm going to send an angel. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, an angel, all the nations have an angel. They all have a guardian angel that is guiding them. But we need to be different. We need to know that we don't have an angel above. We just have Hashem. That's the meaning of that Ein Mazal Yisrael. That the Jews don't have a mazal. They don't have a constellation, a zodiac sign that guides them. Who guides them? Hashem Himself. הבדלה, דרושה ומתאימה רק ביחס לעניינים שמבחינה חיצונית הם דומים. Separation is only needed for things that are externally similar. כך גם הציווי קדושים תהיו אינו מתייחס לתורה ומצוות, שכן בהן אין לאומות העולם כל אחיזה. And so when it says, you shall be sanctified, it's not talking about Torah and mitzvos. That can't be. That doesn't mean to be sanctified. What you're required to do doesn't yet sanctify you. Because what you're required to do is sort of like saying, fish are different than land animals because they swim in water. That's not what separates them. That they need in order to survive. What separates them, what makes them different might be, for instance, that they don't close their eyes. Or that they sleep with their eyes closed or open. Or anything like that. So where is it? Kan medubar b'divrei reshut. It has to be talking, as we said, separation has to be talking about things that are permissible. And there we're the same. Because I can go and eat in a restaurant, and just like anybody else, it's permissible. It's got a good health. Sure, it's just I'm eating like anyone. That's what I do. It says separation means doing something special with those things that are permissible. Achila, shtiya, mischar, when you eat, when you drink, when you conduct your business. דברים שלגביהם דומים יהודים לכאורה מבחינה חיצונית לעמים אחרים ביחס לכך אומרת התורה קדושים תהיו. So in all those things, in all those areas of life in which we are the same as anyone else, that's where we become sanctified. You're not sanctified because you put tefillin on in the airport. As strange as that is, that's like a fish being ported around with an aquarium. It's just the way he lives. That doesn't set him apart. What sets us apart? That when we're like everyone else, we still do things differently. So that when he's on the plane, he asks for a kosher meal. Everybody's eating, but then you see really how different you are, because everybody gets this one thing, and you get something completely different, and that's what really sets apart. כיצד ייתכן שתהיה קדושה גם בשעת הימצאות בענייני העולם הזה, בייחוד בזמן הגלות של חושך כפול ומכופל? How is it possible for there to be sanctity in worldly matters? And these things were the same as everyone else, especially during the time of the exile, with the double and triple darkness in the world, that you can't see godliness. כלפי כך נאמר כי קדוש אני. About this, the Torah says, "V'yitkadishtem v'yitem kedoshim." You should sanctify yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Because I am holy. B'chol makom shebnei Yisrael nimtzeim harei הם קשורים עם הקדוש ברוך הוא. Wherever a Jew is, he's connected to God. Im ata kadosh, with the one who is holy. ולפיכך הם גוי קדוש עד דומה לקדושתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא. יכול כמוני בניחותא. And here comes the big chap. What does it mean to be holy? We said, the sages say, can you be as holy as I? They say, no, you can't be as holy as God. It's not the same thing. But in the Chassidus it was read, Benichuta. Who read it this way? The Maor Enaim, the Rebbe of Chernobyl. Menachem Nochem of Chernobyl. It says, Yachol Kamoni. It's not a question. It's a statement. Yachol Kamoni. You can be like me. How can you be like me? So we already said.
What's the translation of the word
Nichuta. Not questioning, but stating. Stating as a statement. You can be like me. How can you be like me? How can there be such a thing? How can there be such a thing? How can you be sanctified as God? The sage says you can't. Say you can't. תכליתו של יהודי הרי לא להיות לבדו קדוש. כי כפי שנאמר לגבי היהודי הראשון, אברהם אבינו אשר צווה את בניו ואת ביתו אחריו ושמרו דרך השם. The purpose of being holy is not for yourself. It's how you address others. And in this case, it's like what Avram said, what is said about Avram, that he will command his children and his household after him to keep the way of God. And that is why the next commandment in the Parsha is Ishimo v'aviv tirao, that you should be sensitive to your parents. Kan remuzah chovat hachinuch. This is alluding to the obligation to educate your children. And education is a poor translation for chinuch, but I don't know how to say it any different. For years I haven't found a different word. המחנכים הראשונים של האדם הם אמו ואביו, ולהם להחדיר בילדים את ההרגשה כי הם שונים מכל העולם וכי הם בני גוי קדוש. The first educators that a person has are his father and mother, and they should be the ones instilling in him the feeling that he's different from the rest of the world, that he's the member of a holy nation. סדר הכתוב הוא אמו ואביו. And in this verse, as opposed to the Ten Commandments, where it says you should honor your father and your mother, here the order is, first his mother, and then his father. So here the Rebbe is setting up something that later he'll develop over the years, that since the mother is the beginning of education for the child, she's the main actor in the household, and she's also the one who spends the most time with the children. So she has the most duties about their education, about their upbringing. Maybe chinuch is like upbringing. But איך אפשר להשפיע על ילדים ועל גם על האדם עצמו להביא לידי ונפלינו אני ועמך כלפי כך בהציבו השלישי את שבתותיי תשמרו. How can you affect others, meaning your children, and how can you affect yourself to feel that you are a different people? Says the Rebbe, this is what the third commandment in our parsha, keeping Shabbos, which Shabbatai Tishmoru, it comes to teach us. So again, let's just recap, because maybe it wasn't clear until what happened until now. To be holy means, as he'll explain in the second part of the Sicha, which is just a continuation, really. This is all separation. It's chapter. I said it wrong before. Chapters 1 through 5 are also separation, just like chapters 6 through 11, I think. No, through 13. They're all separation. The submission wasn't acharei. It was just an acharei. The submission was a little bit short. So what he's saying here is that sanctity, he didn't spell it out, but it's between the lines. That sanctity is always about those things that you're similar to everybody in. Meaning the things that are permissible. That's not where you gain your sanctity. So the first element of the separation has to be that you're addressing those things that you don't need to use force with. They're a question of identity. You can't talk about identity. Again, it's like saying the identity is that he lives in this and this address. Why is that his identity? Because everybody has a certain address. It's a permissible thing. It's not like some. If you would say the identity of this person is that he keeps Torah and mitzvos, that would be like saying the identity of the fish is that he lives in water. That's not his identity. That's his nature. That's something different. To build identity is always through those things that are permissible. And it's a very important concept in separation. That separation is always addressing not the Torah and mitzvos. It's addressing the person's psychology. It's not that easy to just say, oh, because I keep Torah and mitzvos, I'm now a Jew. He says, no, that's for your life. That's for your being able to keep your life going. Otherwise, you just don't have the basic necessities of life. Identity is one higher level than meeting your physical and spiritual demands or needs. And identity has to be a higher frame of reference in the way that a person sees themselves. And therefore, it has to talk about permissible things. It can't talk about those things. You can't say, my identity is that I eat food. That doesn't make any sense. If you would say, if you would say, my identity is that I can't eat, maybe we'll say, I can't eat something that everyone else eats. No, not because of kashrus reasons, because of dietary reasons. That's a little bit closer. Like a person has celiac, and he says, I can't eat gluten. That makes more of their identity. But still, it's very no, it's a gvuli. Gvuli. I wouldn't say gvuli though.
Gvuli is tenuous.
No, tenuous is weak. No, gvuli is very it's borderline. It's not really identity yet. It's true that it takes up a lot of a person's energy and the way they see themselves, but that's not. They won't define themselves that way in the end. I'm a person who has celiac. It's not that. The identity has to go beyond the body. It has to go beyond the regular things that the body needs to survive. And so it has to talk about things that are one notch higher, one level higher in our existence. Okay? So that's why it has to go to those things that are the same as everyone else. So everybody has ice cream. Oh, but I specifically can't have that ice cream. Why? Because I eat kosher. But you have to, it can't be that it's something that I have to have it. It's not like I need to sleep. I can't identify myself that way. Those bodily needs, they don't create identity. They just create existence, which is not important. It's the basis of life. Okay? But that's not yet identity. Identity is, what he's stressing here, has to be a higher level. And this higher level, you see it, that he's saying that your identity is built by your parents. So you begin to understand, it's not by my parents making sure that I have a formula to eat, or whatever a baby eats. That's not it.
But your identity is a genetic thing, so it's got nothing to do with chinuch whatsoever.
That's not identity. That's exactly the point. Genetics is not your identity. Genetics cannot define your identity. Meaning, if you're defining yourself only by your physical factors, celiac, I'm tall, I have blue eyes.
Identity can't be that you're Jewish?
It's not enough. If everybody was Jewish, meaning everybody was religious in some way, and you would say, I'm Jewish, okay, that would be enough. But not everybody shows their religion. In fact, most religions you wouldn't know about. Identity has to be a level higher than what the body just dictates, what nature dictates. And so that's why it comes from the parents. Because you could say the genetics would be the same if I had my parents or not. It wouldn't change. The moment I'm conceived, those are my genetics. That's going to define what kind of food I like, what kind of food I tolerate, how much I need to sleep, how smart I am. All those things are already predetermined the moment that I'm conceived. That's not identity. That, I'm not saying that's not important. It's tremendously important. That's the basis of life. But that's not identity. Identity is much higher than that. That's why when we talk, for instance, about that's why identity has become an issue in the last 40, 50 years. There's this thing called identity politics now. It's not talking about the physical existence of the person. That's not what identity is about. And I told you that the people who study this, so they brought a word back from the Greek grave, an ancient word that the Greeks used that was sort of like pride. But it's not, it doesn't mean that, and I don't remember what it is, so don't ask me for what it is, I just don't remember it. And it's something that Plato uses in the Republic, in his dialogue of the Republic, in discussing the sort of feeling that the warrior class in a kingdom have. It's this, in French you'd say this esprit de corps, right? You'd say this comradeship, something. But it's more than that. It's not just between them. It's also how they treat others, meaning they expect to be treated differently. But it's not because they're bigger and stronger. That's not it. It's because they define themselves in a different way as a class of people. And they do this by dressing differently. That everybody dresses, but they dress differently. They have their own language. And that's also been studied a lot about what makes a group, what makes a cohesive group. One of the most important things is an internal language that they use. They use the same language as everybody else. They're talking Greek. But they have their own words, they have their own usages, they have their own jokes.
Because it's based on common memories.
Many things. But it sets them apart. That's where identity is. Identity is always a higher tier of human existence than just a physical existence. So he says that comes from the parents. That's the second element. And the third element here is what he's now discussing. Again, this is all in creating identity, in creating holiness. You could even say that in a certain sense, holiness means identity. What is Shabbos? What is it meant to do? So it doesn't say it's a day of rest, it's this and that. The Torah says that Shabbos is a sign. It's a symbol. What is it a sign for? It's a symbol for our belief in the world being created. We've talked about this many times. it's very difficult. The Baal Shem Tov said this. My soul couldn't come into the world as long as the Greek heresy of the world is eternal was in the air. I couldn't. He says I couldn't even come into the world. It was so. The atmosphere was so dense you couldn't breathe. You couldn't breathe anything spiritual. As long as you believe that God did not create the world, you can't have any kind of relationship with God. That's what he's saying. That's not it. You can do what he says, but you can't have a relationship. The relationship is predicated. It depends on a person feeling that God created the world. If that's not your intuitive experience, then you have no relationship. He's not saying that you have no connection. You have a connection, but no relationship. Relationship means meeting someone. And to meet someone, to meet the Creator, you have to see the Creator as a Creator. If you don't understand Him as a Creator, then there's no relationship. Understand? You can be even God-fearing, like many of the Greeks were. You can be God-fearing and not hurt anyone because you're God-fearing. You know that there's going to be a cheshbon at the end, there's going to be a reckoning at the end, and this and that. But that's not a relationship. A day-to-day relationship with God, to be able to speak to Hashem, you have to believe that God created the world. Now, why it's this way is a long and deep topic. But you have to have that. So much so that the Baal Shem Tov's two great, call them the greatest ones that he talked about, his two greatest innovations were repeating something that we know anyway, but was lost over the generations. The first one was, and with this he was very successful, and he said it was very successful with it, instilling in people the feeling that everything is by divine providence. That you can believe that everything is guided by God, and yet not believe that God created the world. He's like the Greeks. The world was eternal, and you add God as a force that is guiding the world, that is making the world function, and therefore He runs the world, but He didn't create it. That was the Greek belief. That's the thing that the Rambam has to contend with. The Rambam says something that's almost shocking if you're a chassid. He says, if somebody could prove to me that the words of Genesis that mean Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, God created, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, don't mean that He created the world, then I would be very happy with a Greek interpretation. That's what he says. But he's also saying that you can't show that. Nobody's ever been able to show that, because that's not what that God created the world. That was the first innovation, was that God is running the world. Divine providence. The second innovation was that God is recreating the world at every moment. And about that, the Alter Rebbe said that the Baal Shem Tov was not successful. Most people don't have an innate feeling God is recreating reality at every moment. Why was the Baal Shem Tov so adamant about this? Because that is the basis of being able to have a moment-to-moment relationship with God. If to have a relationship at all, you have to believe that God created the world. To have a relationship at every moment, you have to feel that God is recreating the world at every moment. Meaning you have to feel that if God were not to recreate the world, it would go back into not being. It's more even the opposite. If you don't feel that, who are you talking to? Because the world is just the world, right? What is the world? It's a set of laws and it's running, and that's it. Who are you talking to? At the end of life there's a reckoning? Okay, fine, that I understand. There's divine providence, I understand that. But to say that at any moment I can address God and He'll do what I ask Him to do, for that you have to have a faith that He recreates the world at every moment. Okay, so says the Rebbe, the point of the Shabbos is to instill in your identity the idea that the world is created, even before we come to recreate it at every moment. If you don't have that, call it the basis upon which your relationship with God exists, then you don't have what we call a holy identity. You don't have holiness yet. You haven't set yourself apart yet. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow.
Is Kedoshim, I'm going to put back the tefillin next to you.